Hello. Our story begins inside the facilities at Tipoca City. Silence filled the room. There was a sense of somberness because Nala Se, after all her years of success, had failed. Everyone bowed their heads as she held herself up over her desk. The data was conclusive. The clone army would not meet the deadline needed by Tyrannus and therefore the Republic. He demanded that the clone military needed to be ready in time for the end of the decade. A war was coming. This military could and would be used to right the wrongs in the galaxy. Nala Se read over the information again, before looking at the physical results. The Kaminoans used various types of accelerated aging to study if it would work. On smaller batches, it usually wasn't a problem, but the Jango Fett genome was having difficulty. They used some other study attempts, like cloning themselves to see if it would work. As they discovered, humanoids had a tendency to struggle in the early years of development. Children with accelerated aging had complications, most of them leading to death. Nala Se made the point that they could theoretically exhaust their resources to make an accelerated army, but it probably wouldn't get them anywhere. She admitted that the price to pay for making so many useless clones would cost them 10 times more than it would to just build an army of regular development. Prime Minister Lama Su walked around the group of scientists and asked Nala Se what she would suggest. She turned around and cradled the datapad closer to her chest. She told the Prime Minister that it would make more sense to build more facilities and use the extra funding to work on building a much larger clone army. With the extra time, that being 18 to 20 years, they could produce a military with well over 15 million units. Lama Su was considerably worried for a moment. That would come with so many additional upgrades to their facilities. They'd have to create at least another city, if not a third after that. Tipoca City was already pushing their limits with over 1 million units for this project. She agreed, but pending the adjustment made by Tyrannus, they could also maximize profits by doing this too. With extra time to build their army, she could start production on experimental units, and if they overshoot the price needed, perhaps they could return to Borovio for extra research. Lama Su thought for a moment, and considered the benefits of reopening the facility at Borovio. The Prime Minister saw the potential for profit if they added additional facilities not related to the Grand Army project. They could become the cloning powerhouse of the galaxy, and having 20 full years of constant operation would only be beneficial for themselves in the long run. Lama Su nodded his head and left the room to open up a long-range communication with Tyrannus. The following discussion would be difficult for everyone, mostly the Sith. Palpatine had already won himself election and was in no place to make himself Chancellor for more than 3 terms. He didn't have that popularity yet, and even if he remained a populist, there was no way he would stay in office after his term expired. The Sith agreed to allow the Kaminoans to create the clone army over the span of 18 to 20 years, even if they didn't have a plan in place yet. Dooku did want to know why Palpatine agreed to this, and the answer was simple. He'd figure it out. Didn't matter how he did it, the answers would come to him eventually. The construction of new facilities were approved on Kamino, and updates were made to the structures on Borovio. Nala Se left the initial genome formula inside Tipoca City and focused her efforts on the projects at Borovio. This was very intentional, because basic cloning wasn't all that difficult to do. The accelerated aging and so forth was the problem for her. Palpatine, in an effort to earn more loyalty from the Kaminoans, used leftover funds from Damask Holdings to fund the construction of Kaminoan City No. 2 and the beginning of City 3, while also assisting Nala Se with some of her personal projects. The deal with Nala Se was more focused on creating a long-lasting alliance between the Sith Lord and the Chief Medical Scientist. Palpatine wanted to begin working on Project Necromancer immediately. If the Empire wouldn't come for another 20 or so years, then he needed to spread his Imperial plan out through a rigorous redesign. The Sith plan could be accomplished, but some major changes needed to be made. Firstly, Anakin Skywalker's seduction either needed to come within 13 years or before the end of this decade. War was meant to make that process easier for the transformation. Palpatine needed to work extra hard on making that happen. Secondly, his role as Chancellor was now completely in question. He could either split his term down the middle, with a successful first term and return years later to clean up a quote-unquote mess, or hope that he could force executive emergency powers into his hands with some sort of external crisis. Thirdly, Dooku was a major question. Tyrannus was already a couple decades older than Palpatine. He was born in 102 BBY, and by the end of the next 20 years, he'd be over 90 years old, which might ultimately lead to his death, due to any sort of reaction the dark side would have on his already old body. A new apprentice, not named Anakin, had to be considered, someone with the political savviness to navigate a separatist movement while still being loyal enough to be killed off in betrayal if the time came. Fourthly, Palpatine's plans for total galactic war were created for a period going up to 15 years, which did include the creation of the clone army. He wanted a 13-year period, 10 years of grace with building tension, and 3 with complete destruction. He accounted for a potential 5 in case. All of that had to be changed now, and Palpatine began scheming with Dooku on how they might convince the Republic to remain completely at odds with itself. It couldn't just be internal either. That wouldn't be entirely feasible for 20 whole years. Palpatine didn't think highly of the Republic itself, but he thought that 2 decades of internal civil unrest wouldn't work either. The plan he and Tyrannus concocted would have to change the future of the Republic for good. The next decade of life on Kamino would also be completely different. The Kaminoans were stretched out thin, resulting in the hiring of off-world tutors and instructors. The basic classes for the clones weren't rushed, but due to their advanced development, due to the specified cloning process done by the Kaminoans, most of the 10-year-old clones were functioning like full-blown 20-year-old adults. Their minds were developed, they were trained with blasters, functional with strategy, and every clone that didn't end up like a 99 defect had highly capable intelligence. The 3 cities on Kamino, Topoka, Shibuya, and Mpyong, were filled with life. Kaminoans were typically a recluse people, but they couldn't afford to with the amount of clones they ended up creating. Unlike their original prediction for 15 million units, they overshot their quota, hoping for an extra cash bonus from the Republic. The thought behind the move was that people outside the Republic would value the high working consistency of the Kaminoans, rather than their seclusiveness or whatnot. This was a very necessary evolution of their business model. They used the clone army to perfect what they had already mastered. With new teachers, trainers, and weapon specialists around the 3 major cities every day and night, the clones got the best of everything. Kamino was already a machine, and it tripled its effectiveness in just 2 years after the change of plans were set in stone. The first batch of clones was still 200,000 units large, while the next batch was a resounding 5 million units large. There were so many clones, and they could afford to have them. Due to the extra time provided by the Sith, the scientists and cloners were able to maximize their product. Due to the accelerated aging not playing a factor, all 20 million units were just shy of each other by a gap of 3 years at the most. So even when the war started, whenever that was, the youngest batches would be able-bodied and ready for battle. Due to the way Nala Se designed the genome model, all clones would reach their full adult height by the time they hit age 15. Everything else after that was just additional training that could help them. But that was also the purpose of the clone army. They were originally going to have 10 or less years of training, done in double the time due to the doubled accelerated aging. Now though, that wasn't even a question or a second thought. The clones would have a full life of development, training, and experience before ever touching an actual battlefield. It also helped that several bounty hunters, mercenaries, and pirates were hired to work with the clones on their training. It wasn't apparent yet, but the developmental period would allow for the average clone trooper to operate at the level of an ARC trooper, or even a commando on the individual level. Imagine an army full of ARC trooper caliber soldiers. That was just the tip of the iceberg too, because that didn't account for the actual ARC troopers, commandos, or other special forces. Individuals like Captain Rex still had another 8 years of training to go. thanks to being a Generation 1 clone. He would thrive, like his other brothers would, with continuous training without bloodshed or total loss. Even though the 3 aforementioned cities on Kamino were working overtime, it paled in comparison to the work that Nala Se was doing with the Bora Vio facilities. Project Necromancer wasn't dead in the water per se, but it was evolving in ways that not even Palpatine could have comprehended. These facilities were for experimental units exclusively. Clone Force 99 was being raised inside the Extended Tower, with 3 other variants of their model. There were 4 in total, 99 variants, 99.1 with Hunter, Wrecker, and the others, then a .2, .3, and .4. Bora Via, though, wasn't just a facility ran for Necromancer or the experimental clone units. Minister Lama Su went outside of his comfort zone to speak with other versions of sentience, like, for example, the slugs from Nal Hutta. The Kaminoans wouldn't take on anything as large as the clone army, but they would, for example, clone members of criminal families to assist them with avoiding political or rival assassinations. Because most of these were individual projects, the cloners charged a surplus for each individual model, but the people paid the price for them because they could afford the price the Kaminoans demanded. It was a functional, miniature society, one that operated with peak efficiency. Necromancer, while slowing down due to some developments, wasn't the only project in the works from the former Chancellor. Outside of the cloning worlds, Palpatine took advantage of Dooku's connections to the corporate world. Geonosian engineers combined with extra resources from the Trade Federation and eventually a few other powerhouse conglomerates in the galaxy came together. They were constructing the Death Star, in the orbit over Geonosis. It was a superstructure being hauled together inside the asteroid field. Because creating a magnificent droid army wasn't the main goal anymore, same with a super dreadnought like the Malevolence, they focused all their available resources on Stardust. The Death Star was about halfway through its construction. The way the Geonosians designed the product was in stages. Due to the sheer size of the vessel, and the Sith's desire to keep it completely hidden from the Republic, entire floors were constructed around the belt separately. It was brilliant too. Sure, it forced the workers to spend more time on the product, but they were adding specific levels of shielding to each compartment. When the vessel would be finished, whenever that might be, the plan was to put it all together like a large puzzle. Just snap each subsection together and make a moon-sized space station. It would be a bit smaller than originally planned though. It was also because of this that the Geonosians were able to fix any initial problems created by the creation of the vessel. Not that they had a Galen Urso holding them back, but there were some hiccups along the way that were easily found because of how they were building it. Sidious, on the other hand, was focusing on his own personal mission to undermine the Republic. He recognized that he couldn't be Chancellor forever, even if they forced a separatist uprising, so instead, they gathered allies. Palpatine announced early on that he only wanted to serve the Republic for 1 term, to fix all the leftover problems from Valorum's regime. The former Chancellor coughed up peace and prosperity, so it was his duty to bring it all together and create a strong economy for the public. The truth is, due to his populist positions, he was able to accomplish these goals with little to no problems. Palpatine's first 4 years were seamless. Because he wasn't focused on building a separate coalition with Dooku's leadership, he could create a more stable government that was bound to fall apart after him. For example, he created a 2-part tax system that would function as a backstab to the future administration that eventually came in. Step 1 of this tax code was a middle-class relief taxation. It focused taxes on the top 1%, which would liberate the commoners to thrive for his entire term with low taxes and more return on their labor. The second part of his tax code needed to be overturned by a 2/3 majority inside the Senate, and no one could do that, especially because of what the second tax code entailed. The first one expired 2 months after his first term ended, with the second tax code blindsiding the middle class and lower class with a 15% hike in taxes. As the first bracket targeted the elite, this one would excuse them almost entirely. It's why the Senate agreed to this package, because eventually they would see their return. Palpatine set all of this into motion before ever announcing that he never planned on running for a second term. It basically made the next term a suicide attempt for any politician, because they would get stuck with a 6-year-long tax code that would demolish the middle and lower class. Palpatine understood that money moved worlds. He could be a good politician and have a successful term, but if people weren't financially happy, then they would vilify him. The Federation blockade spooked the market, but Palpatine ran a smooth ship. It's why what he did with the tax code was so important. Everyone would remember the prosperity they experienced under the Palpatine administration, not the suffering they endured after the following ones. In his absence from the Senate, Palpatine remained a face in the public eye. He drew up a lot of natural support as an oligarch that stood up for the little guy, when in reality, his entire motive was to turn the little guy against itself, and push for a stronger government, one that would turn him into its emperor. Palpatine, outside of the Chancellor role, existed as a political advisor. This also aided his case for returning to leadership down the line. Everywhere he went, he fixed. That's what people saw, or felt at least. So while he may have not been the Chancellor, he was still moving around the galaxy and helping people in the public eye. This created resentment towards the government when the second part of his tax code kicked in, which is exactly what he wanted. Instead of the Clone Wars dividing the people by entire sectors of the galaxy from the mid-rim to the outer rim to the core, he wanted to break the Republic entirely. Small militaries would be homegrown in his absence. The whole taxation without representation thing became a huge theme after he left office. So with homegrown armies and conglomerate droid militaries being created, he was building a scenario that would force people to choose him. Basically, Palpatine wanted the core Republic government to be the center of discussion. People would put their faith into their local planetary government officials after multiple failed Chancellor terms from the Republic. Then, right when the thought of overthrowing the Republic became a concept, Palpatine would swoop in. He would be the hero of the government. But then, the conflict would become not just a meshing of frustration for the central government, but distrust in local authorities for trying to usurp it. Essentially speaking, Palpatine wanted to turn people against their local authorities and breed complete distrust across every system. Instead of a confederacy or republic, this would be the ultimate conflict to break the core heart of the galaxy. People would distrust their neighbors, friends, and family. Then, of course, Palpatine would raise his clone army of 20 million units and sweep over the galaxy with a ruling fist. Those who pledged themselves to him would be rewarded, while those who didn't, those who joined these local militias or homegrown militaries, would suffer the consequences. Martial law, crackdowns in local cities, and whatever he needed to do to establish quote-unquote justice. It was Palpatine's counter to losing out on the Clone Wars and the chaos that would bring. And the truth is, after becoming the figurative angel of prosperity on the local level, wherever he wanted, this was everything he needed to become emperor. Despite two major pieces to the puzzle going well for the Sith, there were some missing pieces. He had another apprentice lined up, a young man, a little older than Skywalker, who had a tendency to rely on the dark side. He had been kicked out of the Jedi Order, and always held resentment towards them. He worked on the docks at Corellia, and he stopped Palpatine during one of his local tours. The man was named Erebus. He wasn't just someone that Palpatine promoted to a side piece, but someone he taught the powers of the dark side to. Dooku was perfectly fine with this because he was turning local officials against the Republic. Dooku was basically fulfilling the inverse roles of Palpatine. He also, towards the end of this period, took Ventress under his wing. As for Grievous, he would not be joining the Sith or the Separatists. He'd be a prospect, but would die in his war against the Huck before they could ever abduct him. Now, while there was Erebus, Sidious was making little to no progress with young Skywalker. Without the protection on Senator Amidala, Anakin's dreams would lead him, Obi-Wan, Luminara, and Barriss to Tatooine. Master Kenobi and Unduli were working together with Barriss and Anakin on a joint instructional mission when Skywalker needed to return to his home world. Thanks to this joint mission, Shmi Skywalker would not die. Master Luminar, despite Obi-Wan allowing Anakin to go alone, refused to let a Jedi Padawan go off into a dangerous desert by himself. The four Jedi, as a result, snuck into the Tusken Raider camp without struggle, but when they found Shmi's hut, Barriss, overcome with grief, broke Jedi protocol and force-healed the dying woman. She saved Shmi's life, and Anakin's entire life was changed forever. The four of them escorted Shmi away from the Tuskens and back to the Lars homestead. Anakin could be annoyed at Luminar for scolding Barriss for breaking protocol, but he only had tears of joy for his friend saving his mother. It brought him so many emotions, most of which he didn't know how to process. This moment, though, solidified Anakin's trust in the Jedi Order, especially in his friend Barriss. Had Obi-Wan and Luminar not suggested this joint mission prior to the nightmares, Anakin would have slipped into the clutches of the Sith. Sidious, because of his public life, was able to spend more time around the Jedi. He and Anakin had a much closer relationship with one another. Kenobi mostly allowed this because it made Anakin happy. This moment wouldn't necessarily push Anakin away from Palpatine, but it would make him rely more on his friendship with Barriss. It was something that Anakin realized he needed. Having been friends with Obi-Wan and Palpatine his entire young adult life, he didn't really consider what he was missing by not having a friend of his own age. Barriss had always been kind to him, despite being a year younger than him. This was his chance to connect with someone that was similar in age to him and likely shared similar life experiences. Even based off of Barriss's breaking of protocol, Anakin could tell that they were kinda similar. So, all of Sidious's hard work to coax Anakin away from the Order slipped away from him in one moment. Not because Palpatine did anything wrong, but because Anakin needed to evolve the friendships he was lacking with people his own age. Palpatine couldn't do anything to change Anakin's desires. There was some tension between master and apprentice, but that didn't last for too long because Kenobi requested for Anakin to begin his trials for knighthood. He also encouraged Luminar to do the same. Master Unduli was a lot more hesitant because Barriss was 18, but she and Anakin were getting along, and they fed off of each other's personality and skills. Thus, they both became knights. Palpatine's second term as Chancellor came well over a decade following the end of the first one. Civil unrest was filling the streets of nearly every planet in the galaxy. The Republic was a failing system. The Jedi Order was trying to maintain the balance by working on behalf of the Senate and its failed oligarchs, senators, and failing autocrats. The system was collapsing, and after the radical change of leadership from the High Council, people were looking to Palpatine to save them again. But as Palpatine had hoped, there was already a growing divide, one he could not stop. With so many local planetary militaries threatening the Republic Senate and the major conglomerates, thanks to Dooku, supporting minor systems across the galaxy, the Republic called for all-out martial law. This Clone War wasn't just set to be one major conflict against a single opposition government. This was truly multiple minor wars combined into one overarching conflict. The Clone Wars rung out with the arrival of the first 200,000 units from Kamino. The Generation clones, one of which being Commander Rex of the Rancor Battalion, were all 20 years old at this point. They had trained their entire lives, and they were the first to leave their watery home of Kamino. Before the arrival of the Grand Army of the Republic, there were some minor updates about the changes since the first decade. Dooku was regulated to Castle Sereno. He was ironically everything he hated about the Republic before he betrayed and murdered Yaddle. Ventress was not by his side. Instead, she was serving with Erebus on a separate mission elsewhere in the galaxy. Tyrannus' body was abused by the Force. Now, he only attended meetings and pushed people further away from the Republic. He was the anchor of a movement, without a face. No one knew who he was, and honestly, no one really cared. He was the backer of the biggest threat the Republic had seen in generations. Erebus, on the other hand, was the perfect pupil in Palpatine's eyes. He of course still wanted Skywalker, but if the plan fell through, Erebus and Ventress would be the perfect combination. They were a duo that truly matched each other's poise. Sidious trained them both the way he would have trained Maul had he survived. Of course, that Zabrak had been found dead on the trash world of Lothal Minor. These two students, though, weren't exactly what he wanted them to be yet. Palpatine's true target, Anakin, was a force of nature on the other hand. Despite coming from the lineage that started with Dooku and Yoda, Anakin didn't reflect any of the political tendencies that were more common with Dooku or Qui-Gon. He was a free soul, not bound to what the Republic did, yet his missions brought him across the galaxy to slow rising resistance movements. With Shmi still alive on Tatooine, Anakin was content. Barriss was also a really important person in his corner. Anakin still remained friendly with Palpatine, but had since lost interest in Padme. He had his best friend and his mother, both of which brought him more internal peace than he would have found otherwise. Regardless, Skywalker had already trained Ahsoka to knighthood, and stood as a true Jedi Master. His initial aspirations for becoming a counselor changed, as he focused more on combat and assisted as a weapons master inside the Jedi Order. He, like several other Jedi, were out interacting with the population when the call for revolution came. Palpatine, quote-unquote, tried to bring people back into the alliance with the government, but it was too far gone, thanks to his tax codes that gutted the middle class that weren't exactly made better by previous administrations. Several star systems revolted with the removal of Republic-aligned officials, and protesters, armed with weapons, marched on the capital. Palpatine sent out a transmission to the galaxy, informing them that he couldn't help them if they continued to fight back. This wasn't heard because it was already too late, and as a result, the clone troopers landed on the surface of Coruscant. A fleet deployed 200,000 units of shinies. Their armor glistened under the sun, and they marched in formation to protect the Senate Plaza. The Jedi were surprised by these reinforcements, but they took the side of the clone army, understanding that they were from the Chancellor. Anakin watched from the front steps of the Senate building with Master Afi and Knight Ahsoka as tension turned to chaos. The people brought with them, per Dooku's instruction, the base model battle droid and its heavier sibling. Due to how much time the conglomerates had to prepare, the droid armies of the Resistance were made up of B-2 super battle droids and dark troopers. This was a more menacing fighting force. This didn't look like a self-defense group either, more like a conquering military. The three Jedi observed quietly, while reporting back to Grandmaster Mundi about the situation. Ki-Adi-Mundi monitored the city, and reported on several other protests erupting across it. For hours, this would remain the status quo. Just people bickering at an army of clone troopers, without anything really important to say. The clones knew their duty. They were soldiers of the Republic. They were going to do their job and protect the government. Palpatine, from their perspective, seemed like a victim. He was adored during his first term, and returned to fix another bad situation, only for the population to seemingly turn against him. They were willingly ready to help him make things right. That remained the case peacefully, until one of the super battle droids quote-unquote malfunctioned. It was all caught on live broadcast. The droid launched a wrist rocket into the clone lines, sending nearly a dozen of them off of their feet, killing half and wounding the other half. All of the other troopers readied their weapons and unloaded into the faces of the protesters and battle droids. Clones dispersed and the Jedi ignited their sabers. The Jedi clearly tried to stop the clones from firing on the protesters because they didn't do anything wrong, but in their efforts they'd be clipped by clones, unintentionally or killed directly by the battle droids. Clones, though, did what they could to protect the Senate Plaza. They already had ramparts, and they quickly piled up behind them and issued out orders. Commander Rex stood behind the line and moved between blaster bolts as he fired shots at the closing-in battle droid army. It was huge. The supers were already hard enough to kill, not to mention the firepower they possessed. The clones were trained for this moment. Men shuffled across the line as they were slowly overrun by the sheer amount of battle droids, and then civilian protesters turned violent insurgents. They gathered the weapons of fallen dark troopers, or clones, and started attacking the Republic line. Anakin, Ahsoka, and Barriss rushed down into the fray, igniting their weapons, and rallying the men up against the high water mark. The droids made an indent into the line, but Master Skywalker and the other Jedi present built a defense bubble. Rex and the rest of Rancor Battalion got to the edge of the ramparts and started slaughtering the attackers. Across the city and throughout the Republic, various other battles in similar magnitude would transpire. Due to most of the protection being grouped up on Coruscant, certain worlds fell under Resistance occupation, forcing the Chancellor to covet emergency powers and declare war against this rebellion. He did so with a heartfelt speech that his supporters ate up. The people realized what was at stake. Some were radicalized by Palpatine's inaction over the past decade and a half, while others understood that they needed to fight for their Chancellor and save their Republic. These were completely opposite responses, but it led to the Clone War truly becoming a galactic civil war. This wasn't really a conflict of sides. Every single planet immediately and almost overnight turned into a war zone. Jedi were captured for simply interjecting in the conflict, trying to stop it from happening. Republic loyalists were strung up and executed. Resistance fighters were gunned down in the streets. The Republic called for more troopers as a military creation bill was drafted up and signed, giving Palpatine the ability to control the clone army as his own personal military to protect the Republic. The Jedi, under Master Mundi's leadership, stood beside the Republic, believing in the system itself, rather than the attack on the government. Anakin remained loyal to the Jedi, and he committed himself to interacting with the High Council more. Battle Master Mace Windu also used the skirmish from Coruscant and Anakin's leadership to start instructing students on how to fight these masses of battle droids. The war for the Republic kicked off with several active battlefronts growing across the galaxy, mostly between citizens. The fight was brutal, and the Loyalists believed that it would come to an end, but Dooku's final act would have the people believing that the Resistance was more able-bodied than the Republic believed them to be. This would come from the activation of the Geonosian-built Death Star. Palpatine's students, Erebus and Ventress, would take the helm of the superstructure and lead it to the system of Iridium. It was the most populated Republic loyalist stronghold south of the core, and the Death Star, in one blast, destroyed it. One singular powerful blast left 22 billion souls dead. Comparatively, Alderaan's population had nearly 2 billion people on it. With not even a full month having gone by since the beginning of this civil war, people were shocked. It did exactly as Palpatine wanted it to do. Billions of Republic loyalists surrendered their cause and joined up with the Resistance. Now, maybe you're thinking, why would Palpatine want more of his own loyalists to join the rebellion? Because the more people that fight against you, the easier it is to round them all up as traitors and blacklist them. Those who don't buckle when a system or two is destroyed in one singular blast are truly worthy of living the good life. Everyone else, though, well, they were on their own in Palpatine's eyes. Of course, the destruction of Eridu sent the Jedi into a panic, and Palpatine agreed something needed to be done. Master Skywalker and his apprentice should go. This was Palpatine's decision to isolate Anakin from Barriss and Ahsoka. If those two could be killed by Erebus and Ventress, then Skywalker would break, and his turn to the dark side would be completed. Plus, Palpatine never believed that Skywalker would die to either of the acolytes. But if they killed the Chosen One, then they would be worth Sidious's time. It was also here where Dooku, on his deathbed, gave out his final orders. Tyrannus had lived a life of honor and dedication to the Jedi Order and Republic. The last 20 or so years of his life were in a fight to save the galaxy. Today, though, on the weakest day of his growing sickness, he realized the fool he was. He wasted his life on this. It was no coincidence that Sidious wanted Eridu destroyed on the same day that Dooku went to his deathbed. Palpatine couldn't help but gloat over his friend, the one he promised a free and safe galaxy to. This was not that. Tyrannus bought into that lie, and he would die knowing that in his efforts to protect the galaxy, he ended up killing 22 billion people because he trusted a Sith. The attack on the Death Star took another 2 weeks to get to, and it didn't come until after the weapon destroyed another planet, Malastare. This came with another 2 billion dead, and several billion more abandoning the Republic cause to avoid all-out destruction. The battle was more conventional naval warfare than any other during the war. In the wreckage of Malastare, a Republic fleet exited from hyperspace. The Death Star was protected by a trio of Lucrehulks and Techno-Union frigates. The Republic, armed with Venators and proper Star Destroyer models, ripped into action with turbo cannons. The Jedi, more than just the initial trio Palpatine wanted dead, made their attack. This was perhaps the largest fleet in the Republic arsenal. It was meant to capture the superstation. Due to the creation of defenses for the Death Star, its true weakness was a ground invasion. But the ship was filled to the brim with corridors of Resistance fighters, super battle droids, and dark troopers. The landing sequence was met with blaster fire from every direction. Luckily, the men from Clone Force 99 came prepared. This joint attack with Rancor Battalion, Commander Rex, and the Bad Batch was everything the Jedi needed to make this assault work, if they could get through the hangar bay, that is. Wrecker and Crosshair made short work of the frontal assault upon landing, while the Jedi started cutting open another path, which provided covering space for the regulars who readied their blasters and attacked their enemies. The firefight inside the hangar bay was brutal. Clones and battle droids dropped every other second, and the clone pilots that dropped off the troopers were forced to retreat to pick up more. If this weren't an attack that Palpatine wanted to succeed, none of these gunships or troop carriers would have made it inside the Death Star. But he needed his hero of the Republic to feel the presence of power. Anakin needed to be a war hero. Inside the command bridge, Ventress and Erebus watched the Jedi assault, giving the super tactical droid the orders to separate the two Jedi from Skywalker. They left the bridge to begin their pursuit, as the tactical droid managed the entire arena of battle. Clones created a minor medical bay inside the hangar, so they could patch troops up and send them back in. Commander Rex had rotator cannons firing beside him, men who destroyed everything they saw inside the corridors, and then he diverted troops away from the main fight, so they could gain access to the control ports and take over the ship itself. With blasters echoing across the superstructure, one considerably smaller than the original weapon Palpatine envisioned, Skywalker was separated from his peers. Erebus and Ventress attacked Barriss and Ahsoka in a lightsaber duel. Sidious wanted his students to dismember these Jedi and fight Skywalker to the death. But Barriss wasn't just a Padawan anymore, and Ahsoka wasn't just any knight. Their sabers ignited and blazed into action, Barriss holding off the aggressive barrage from Erebus, while Ahsoka and Ventress traded blows while using Jar-Kai. The echoing of their sabers caught Anakin's attention, as he tried to break through the wall he was cut off from. Just another layer of doors closed on his weapon as he was trying to break through, and then he heard the marching of battle droids behind him. Skywalker ripped his saber out of the door, as Qui-Gon did years before, deflecting incoming blaster bolts before weaving the saber around behind his back and launching the weapon down the hallway through a number of droids. In a swift motion with his hands, he crushed the rest of the attackers. His saber flung back into his hands, and he jabbed it harder into the wall. Without a concentrated time of war during his young adult years, Skywalker's natural draw towards darkness was never really exposed. He didn't use the dark side here to break the wall, rather focus in the Force, like Qui-Gon would've and did over Naboo decades before. Once the wall broke down, Anakin looked in at the raising and swinging of sabers. Barriss kicked Erebus backwards and he spun around, rolling his saber to his hip and steadying it into his preferred form. Ahsoka rolled backwards before being launched off her feet by Ventress. Skywalker used the Force to cushion her fall. Anakin rushed into the middle, ripping a saber across the ground and sending sparks through the air in front of Ventress. She shielded her face as Anakin engaged Erebus. Their weapons collided. Erebus was a little larger than Skywalker, and he tried to impose that over his Jedi opponent. Anakin didn't give in though. His focus determined his reality. He shoved backwards, ducking under Ventress's swing, and using the Force to send her towards Barriss. Erebus tried to counter where he thought Anakin would be, but missed. Skywalker used that mistake as the perfect strike. His saber shot straight through Erebus's chest and out of his back. He dropped to his knees and died at that moment. Ventress put up a fight against Barriss, but Ahsoka used the Force to restrict her from parrying a strike, and it cost Asajj her life. As the Sith inside the facility were confirmed dead, Anakin contacted Grandmaster Mundi to inform him of their success. Just as Ki-Adi-Mundi went to inform the Chancellor, he was joined by Sly Moore inside the executive office. The Jedi were already with Palpatine. Master of the Order Kit Fisto and Master Luminara were already waiting for this information. They'd been watching the status of the space battle over Malastare, and were hopeful for the final leg of the battle to be a success. Palpatine listened to Ki-Adi-Mundi as he got over to the Chancellor's desk and told him what Skywalker reported on. Before Palpatine could give his compliments to Master Skywalker's perfect work, Sly Moore interrupted him. She explained that a message from Count Dooku of Sereno just arrived. That was quite the surprise, and well, Dooku got the last laugh. After all of the gloating that Dooku had to endure, especially watching Eridu's destruction, it would be Tyrannus with the final laugh. An explosive shell would coat the room, leaving nothing but the burned silhouettes of 3 Jedi Counselors and the Supreme Chancellor. Sly Moore was outraged by what she helped create, and thus did this for herself and for Dooku, and perhaps the rest of the galaxy. This news, though, would be eclipsed by the heroic capture of the Death Star. But that tragically wouldn't be the saving grace for the Republic or this war. The siege to capture the Death Star took well over 13 hours, mostly because the clones were fighting to secure the control deck. The battle didn't actually end for another 3 weeks, but the news of the Death Star falling into Republic hands came out, and overshadowed the mysterious death of the 5 Republic officials. Though the 3-week conflict inside the corridors of the Death Star would actually be the silver lining in all of this. The revelation of the Death Star and subsequent destruction of Eridu and Malastare came within mere weeks of one another. The Jedi apparently took control over the superweapon and then didn't use it for 3 weeks. Some people saw this as weakness, others believed it was liberation. Mostly, it meant that the billions of people that left the Loyalist fight returned, and the Republic had more widespread support. The tragedy is, though, it did not result in the end of the war. Perhaps it was the Sith that had the last laugh in all of this. The bubbling conflict between the Loyalists and the Resistance was so long-term and well built up that no one suspected that the Sith were involved. For example, the Jedi never knew Dooku had joined the Sith. They didn't even think that Palpatine was related to it. The Order assumed that Erebus and Ventress were the last of the Sith. So that left the galaxy with a problem. A manufactured conflict created out of thin air by the now dead Chancellor. And it wouldn't come to a soft conclusion either. 20 million clone units were deployed to counter a Resistance battle droid force of well over 35 million units. This war was mostly fought on the ground too, and the Jedi absolutely refused to orbital bombard citizens. It was one of the great questions of the war. Would you rather willingly sacrifice thousands to millions of clones just to liberate a city, or eliminate the problem altogether by bombarding the stronghold cities and salvaging what people survived the wreckage? There was no question, the Jedi and clones refused to use the Death Star. That would kill any planet. But using turbo lasers from a Star Destroyer on a population was a different story. For the most part, the Republic refused to use orbital bombardments, and clones were forced to slug their way through battle just to get to victory. Yet, thanks to the training and sheer size of the clone army, this war would come to a conclusion shortly before the year-and-a-half marker of its beginning. The war, though, cost the galaxy trillions of lives, not even including the 2 planets destroyed by the Death Star. In a sick way, even though he wasn't around to capitalize off of it, the Sith won. The galaxy was torn apart. The Republic had no influence, and people questioned everything about their lives. There were new bills to encourage population surveillance on neighbors. These weren't even military people, just neighbor against neighbor, just as the Sith designed it. The Senate called it a patriotic duty, but if it really was, had to be determined by those it affected the most. The tragedy of the Clone War is what it cost the galaxy. People hated everything about the clones. They were evil to most citizens, even the Loyalists. The Jedi were seen in a similar light because they stood by the clones and the Republic. The Republic government had to front the bill for the clone army that created 20 million units, several experimental units, and of course helped finish off the payments for the 2 other cities on Kamino and, well, Borovio too. The irony, though, is that the Republic paying these bills off would also see Project Necromancer successfully complete. No one would ever take advantage of it, aside from Nala Se and the Kaminoans, but who cares? They'd make their money, and the Sith were all but dead. Master Skywalker, after remaining on the Death Star for pretty much the rest of the war, would receive the opportunity to join the ranks of the High Council again. He would this time, as the Master of the Order. A well-liked Jedi that understood his peers. It was perfect in the eyes of many Jedi. Anakin needed it too. After being stationed on the Death Star like a regular military man, his perspective on a lot of things changed, especially on how he understood his own life. Luckily for him though, as Master of the Order, he could make a positive change for the Jedi, and be a positive role model for the Order in the public eye. Not to mention, he'd have the rest of Shmi's life to visit her and maintain a strong relationship. The Republic wouldn't ever truly return again. There'd be a period where the Senate tried to pretend that it could be different, but that didn't end up working, and instead led to more misery. In the end, a new coalition of systems would form around the emerging dominating ecumenopolis of Hosnian Prime. Like all new things, it would take years to find its stride, and until then, tension would remain, but it would form into a proper government. Now, most importantly, for the soldiers that didn't choose their lives or their duty, they were treated fairly by both governments. The Republic and eventually the Coalition would hold internal investigations into the facilities on Kamino. All blame shifted from Sifo Dyas to the mystery man named Tyrannus, the individual that Nala Se and Lama Su agreed actually ordered the clone army. Was this actual backstabbing, or just literally forgetting that Sifo Dyas existed 30 years prior? That remained another question. The clones, though, were given their due process. None of them intentionally did anything outside the limits of their orders. They served the government, and the Coalition would seek to employ them in different ways, as military men in every scenario. The clones would put down thugs in the Outer Rim, crush crime families with the flex of their fingers, and establish a blanket security across the galaxy. Their decades of training and relatively docile personalities led to them instructing new recruits with open arms. Because they were clones with nothing of their own, the Coalition actually paid them, something they didn't know the Republic didn't do. The clones had a really low standard, which tragically allowed the government to take advantage of their service, but they no longer would technically be a slave army. They'd be treated like living, sentient beings. Jango Fett, on the other hand, had the joy of his life, raising Boba away from the war, and watching the Sith lose a conflict they created, while also leaving influence over the galaxy for generations to come. And that, my friends, is a twisted, dark side, light side story, pretty neutral. Special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash the like button. Let's talk about this story. As I just said, this was a very neutral ending, and I wanted it to be that way. This is really meant to be a long, drawn-out Sith plan, and I feel like in a scenario where Palpatine has the opportunity to draw out his Sith plan, I think he can make it work. I really think that Palpatine would be able to technically win. He does technically win in this scenario, but it's just the fact that he's dead. If Palpatine was still alive at the end of this video, I think there's a very real possibility that he can become Emperor in some way, shape, or form. But because he isn't, it just kind of funnels out of control. And that's kind of why, like, the clone army is so large, first of all, and that the droid army is so small, second of all. And the droid army is smaller because the creation of the Death Star and so forth. But I really wanted the two armies to be these pretty equal in size groups, and that the clones would have just incredible training. That's why I made that point that they'd be even more evolved and pretty effective. It's just that the army they're fighting against is just all super heavily armored battle droids, which is kind of terrifying. An army of super battle droids and dark troopers is like a real threat. But I really wanted the clones to have a profound influence on the story, and that their arrival is kind of like kicks off this revolution And that, I think, Palpatine's best way of compromising to a situation that he can't breed a clone army as fast as he wants to is by creating complete social distrust from local planetary systems in the government. So it's like every system starts to distrust Coruscant or the government, the Republic government, and start building up their own little ways to usurp it, and eventually it all bubbles over. It's kind of like miniature civil wars on every planet, as well as a civil war with the actual government, and the government has a clone army. So, I hope you all like this story. This is kind of C-SPAN-y, it's kind of mysterious, there's quite a bit of action, it's like the perfect mesh of everything. So I hope you all enjoyed that, and enjoyed the sick twist that came along with it. But I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.